was left to a fireman on board the Titanic to tell the story of his death and to record his last message. This man had gone down with the White Star Giantess and was clinging to a piece of wreckage for about half an hour before he finally joined several members of the Titanic's company on the bottom of a boat which was floating about among other wreckage near the Titanic. Harry Sr., the fireman, with his 8 or 9 companions in distress, had just managed to get a firm hold in the upturned boat when they saw the Titanic rearing preparatory to her final plunge. At that moment, according to the fireman's story, Captain Smith jumped into the sea from the promenade deck of the Titanic with a little girl clutched in his arms. It took only a few strokes to bring him to the upturned boat, where a dozen hands were stretched out to take the little child from his arms and drag him to a point of safety. Captain Smith was dragged onto the upturned boat, said the fireman. He had a life buoy and a life preserver. He clung there for a moment, and then he slid off again. For a second time, he was dragged from the icy water. Then he took off his life preserver, tossed the life buoy on the inky waters, and slipped into the water again with the words, "I will follow the ship." Other faithful men. Nor was the captain the only faithful man on the ship. Of the many stories told by survivors, all seem to agree that both officers and crew behaved with the utmost gallantry, and that they stuck by the ship nobly to the last. Immediately after the Titanic struck the iceberg, said one of the survivors, the officers were all over the ship, reassuring the passengers and calming the more excitable. They said there was no cause for alarm. When everything was quieted, they told us we might go back to bed, as the ship was safe. There was no confusion, and many returned to their beds. We did not know that the ship was in danger until a comparatively short time before she sank. Then we were called on deck, and the lifeboats were filled and lowered. The behavior of the ship's officers at this time was wonderful. There was no panic, no scramble for places in the boats. Later, there was confusion, and according to most of the passengers' narratives, there were more than 50 shots fired upon the deck by officers or others in the effort to maintain the discipline. 5th Officer Lowe. A young English woman who requested that her name be omitted told a thrilling story of her experience in one of the collapsible boats, which had been manned by 8 of the crew from the Titanic. The boat was in command of the 5th Officer, H. Lowe, whose action she described as saving the lives of many people. Before the lifeboat was launched, he passed along the port deck of the steamer, commanding the people not to jump in the boats, and otherwise restraining them from swamping the craft. When the collapsible was launched, Officer Lowe succeeded in putting up a mast and a small sail. He collected the other boats together. In some cases, the boats were short of adequate crews, and he directed an exchange by which each was adequately manned. He threw lines together connecting the boats, 2 by 2, and thus all moved together. Later on, he went back to the wreck with the crew of one of the boats and succeeded in picking up some of those who had jumped overboard and were swimming about. On his way back to the Carpathia, he passed one of the collapsible boats, which was on the point of sinking with 30 passengers aboard, most of them in scant night clothing. They were rescued just in the nick of time. Engineers died at posts. There were brave men below the deck, too. A lot has been printed in the papers about heroism of the officers, said one survivor, but little has been said of the bravery of the men below the decks. I was told that 17 enginemen who were drowned side by side got down on their knees on the platform of the engine room and prayed until the water surged up to their necks. Then they stood up, clasped hands so as to form a circle, and died together. All of these men helped to rake the fires out from 10 of the forward boilers after the crash. This delayed the explosion and undoubtedly permitted the ship to remain afloat nearly an hour longer, and thus saved hundreds of lives. In the list of heroes who went down on the Titanic, the names of her engineers will have a high place, for not a single engineer was saved. Many of them, no doubt, could not get to the deck, but they had equally as good a chance as the firemen, 69 of whom were saved. The supposition of those who manned the Titanic was that the engineers working below were the first to know the desperate character of the Titanic's injury. The watch called the others, and from that time until the vessel was ready for her last plunge, they were too hard at work to note more than that there was a constant rise of water in the hull and that the pumps were useless. It was the engineers who kept the lights going, saw to the proper closing of bulkhead doors, and kept the stoke hole at work until the uselessness of the task was apparent. Most of them probably died at their post of duty. The Titanic carried a force of about 60 engineers, and in addition, she had at least 25 guarantee engineers, representatives of Harland and Wolff, the builders, and those who had the contract for the engineering work. This supplementary force was under Archie Frost, the builder's chief engineer, and the regular force was under Chief Engineer William Bell of the White Star Line. On the line's ships, there is the chief engineer, senior and junior second, senior and junior third, and senior and junior fourth engineers. The men are assigned each to his own task. There are hydraulic, electric, pump and steam packing men, and the guarantee engineers, representing the builders and the contractors. The duty of the guarantee engineers is to watch the working of the great engines and to see that they are tuned up and in working order. They also watch the working of each part of the machinery, which had nothing to do with the actual speed of the ships, principally the electric light dynamos and the refrigerating plant. Noble-hearted band. But what of the bandsmen? Who were they? This question was asked again and again by all who read the story of the Titanic sinking and of how the brave musicians played to the last, keeping up the courage of those who were obliged to go down with the ship. Many efforts were made to find out who the men were, but little was made public until the members of the orchestra of the steamship Celtic reached shore for the first time after the disaster. One of their first queries was about the musicians of the Titanic. Their anxiety was greater than that of any New Yorker, for the members of the band of the Celtic knew intimately the musicians of the ill-fated liner. "Not one of them was saved," cried John S. Carr, cellist of the Celtic. "It doesn't seem possible they have all gone." "We knew most of them well. They were Englishmen, you know, every one of them, I think. Nearly all the steamship companies hire their musicians abroad, and the men interchange between the ships frequently, so we get a chance to know each other pretty well. The musicians for the Titanic were levied from a number of other White Star ships, but most of the men who went down with the Titanic had bunked with us at some time. The thing I can't realize is that happy Jock Hume is dead," exclaimed Lewis Cross, a player of the bass viol. "He was the merriest, happiest young Scotchman you ever saw. His family have been making musical instruments in Scotland for generations. I heard him say once that they were minstrels in the old days. It is certainly hard to believe that he is not alive and having his fun somewhere in the world. At least he helped to make the deaths of many less cruel." End of chapter 20 of The Sinking of the Titanic.